You've just signed up 5 new clients this week, and now the overwhelm sets in. You have to set up their files, you have to onboard them, you have to set up the learning center for them, order some stuff for them, and don't forget to send the thank you card as well. Well, in today's video, we're going over how to reduce the overwhelm by automating the sales process. Tom Jacobs here. Thank you so much for stopping by the channel today. It's to get your fix on presentation, performance for more profits in your business, especially for those solo practitioners and solopreneurs out there that can feel overwhelmed at times because you're the only person running the show and you have to help people at the same time, so it can be very stressful. I want to help you reduce that overwhelm with all of this great information. And today we're in the command center, is what I like to call my office, the command center, in terms of how I automate a lot of processes in my business and how I help my clients automate some of the processes as well so that they can reduce the overwhelm and get more stuff done, whether that's spend more time with family or take a vacation finally, or just be able to practice better with their current clients, which is oftentimes what they actually end up doing. And look, I'm not immune from the whole burnout, but I think I've overcome that in the 30 plus years that I've been an entrepreneur and have learned through iteration of different businesses and how to get that a lot better. But I remember when I first started in the personal training business, I would onboard a new client. I had to set up their file. I wanted to set up their nutrition plan. I had to set up their exercise program. All the little detail stuff that needed to happen, but it took time to do it. And I actually ended up hiring a half-time employee to actually do a lot of those things for me. But then I found a tool, and I'm going to show you that tool today, in terms of how to automate the process so that it's so much easier because it is automated. Especially since you're a solopreneur, solo practitioner, or even if you have a small staff, you want to be able to automate as much as possible so you take out the chance for human error, which is all over the place because that's just how we are. We have to have a checklist and we have to make sure that checklist is followed properly and step by step. Well, guess what? A computer does that all the time. And the best part is they don't complain about doing it either. That's the power of automation. When I first started my call center business, I wanted to make sure that 2 things happened all of the time. Number 1, the call agents, all they had to do is make phone calls. And all the little ancillary things that happen after the call, during the call, before the call, is automated so that we can spend as much time on the phone as possible, because that's where the revenue is generated, by doing the actual work, not doing all of the ancillary things that actually could be automated. I mapped out the entire process and made sure that it was process oriented. The second thing was that I wanted to make sure that there was a high level of service for our clients and they had as much visibility into our processes as possible. And that again took automation to make sure that the clients had visibility into what we were doing. So again, we could spend more time making sales, booking appointments, doing everything that we do. Now, probably just like you, I didn't understand automation and the power of automation until I really dug into it. And I spent hours and hours and hours figuring out how to automate each one of the tasks and what was possible through these new tools like Zapier or Zapier. Not quite sure. I think it's that Zapier. But make some comments down below. I'd love to. Is it Zapier or Zapier? I think it's Zapier because they call it Zapier makes you happier, and that rhymes. Not Zapier makes you happier. That doesn't really rhyme. So I think it's that Zapier. I digress. I spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to automate in the different tools that I had, because I use Pipedrive, I use Thinkific, I use obviously Zapier, Google Sheets, Jotforms, all these different applications, and they all needed to talk to each other. And I had to learn what was capable, what wasn't capable. And through that, I was able to automate almost everything in my business. And I'll tell you what, we run about 200,000 zaps a month through our system. A lot of the things that I'm going to show you are very easy to set up once you learn the process. And so I'm going to just show you one very simple process where we are onboarding new clients, and this will be applicable to you as you onboard new clients, because there's a lot of little detail things and probably a lot of different systems that need to talk to each other so that you can actually get all of that all set up. So let's go into the computer and let's look at what Zapier looks like. Or Zapier. Zapier. We're going to check that out right now. Here we are on one Zapier I've set up to onboard a new client. And this is the fun part. I consider it fun because I get to problem solve, and I love to problem solve. Once the sale is made, we're like, yes, the sale is made. And then, reality strikes that we have to actually do all this other setup stuff. And maybe it's not the most enjoyable doing that administrative work to get somebody set up. So I created this Zapier so that 80% of everything is just set up, boom, ready to go the moment the sale is made, because those are triggers. So when the sale is made through whatever system that you're using for making sales, whether that's Stripe or PayPal or a form that you have them fill out, whatever it happens to be, 9 times out of 10, you're going to be able to automate that in Zapier. If you're interested in becoming a new business lead maximizer client, this is what's going to happen in the back end. So you can look behind the curtain here, so to speak. But a new client fills out a form. They're going to pay their setup fee, and all that's going to be processed right through the Jot form. And then I put a delay in here, which is cool in case I need to change anything in the form. Then I can kind of stop the Zap before everything else happens. And then we're going to go in and we're going to create the organization within Pipedrive. And this is where it's pretty easy, pretty intuitive. This trigger can be really anything. It can be from any number of programs that you might have: Asana, ConvertKit, Acuity Scheduling, Calendly. All these different things can set up. Once you've set up the program that it's coming from, the trigger, then there can be a number of different events. So it depends on what the program is. If you're using Easy Webinar, Webinar Jam, there's going to be a whole host of different trigger events you can choose from. Same with Google Sheets and things like that. We could test the trigger and see what happens. If we're using Pipedrive, we create an organization. That's the action. If you look here, there's a bunch of different things that we could create to make this happen. Add a follower, attach a file, create a lead. I mean, there's just so many different things. It's so powerful. Pipedrive, by the way, if you need a good sales automation, sales tracking system, I highly recommend Pipedrive. I put a link down below in the description of this video so that you can see all the different resources that I use. Some of them are affiliate links, just to be 100% transparent. So if you use those, that's awesome. I get a little credit from the company. Some are not, because some, like Zapier, they don't have an affiliate program. But I'm happy to promote them because it has saved me so much time. And if you need help in setting that up, schedule a call with me and we can go through what that might look like for us to be able to assist you in doing some of these automations, especially the sales automation. Within Pipedrive, you can actually do a lot of sales automation as well. So I have 2 different Pipedrive accounts, one for the business itself where we make the sales, and then the other for actually making the phone calls for our clients. Now we go into the other Pipedrive, find that person, update the lead and the deal. So I'm moving them along in the Pipedrive automatically through this automation, which is pretty awesome. Then we update the deal to say it was won, or in this case, that the setup is starting. That's the final stage in my pipeline. And then I want to be able to update or enroll that new client, because I do a whole learning center in Thinkific for my clients. We enroll them in the Thinkific, which if you're having a program that you deliver to your patients and your clients, then you're going to want to enroll them in any of the membership sites that are out there, like Thinkific. I personally like Thinkific. Then I send a message to our staff that lets them know that we have a new client, and we start the training process for the agents. And then we create a channel for that client in Slack. We also set that client up in Stripe, update any of the information from them. Then it goes over to QuickBooks. This is like pretty awesome, because now it goes to QuickBooks and sets them up in QuickBooks, and the receipt goes over there. It's pretty nice. And then it goes over and creates their contact and updates all the information within ActiveCampaign so that now they're no longer a lead in ActiveCampaign, takes them out of any kind of lead funnels that I have set up or automations, and then puts them into the client funnel as well. And then we have a couple of tasks that are created in Asana. We create tasks in there so that the appropriate staff sets the rest of the client. It's a 16-step. Now you're looking at this and you're like, oh my God, I could never do that. But think about just a very simple thing that you could do. Like when you onboard a client, you might want to set them up in your Thinkific, and it's really that easy. And then Thinkific takes over in terms of when you enroll somebody and sends an email with their login information and all that. So this is super easy. There's a lot of other things that you can automate within your business. If you're hiring employees, that is one thing that just drives me insane sometimes because we get so many applications for the open positions that we have that going through all of that was such a hassle. So I set up automation so that when somebody fills out the application using a Jot form that goes into a Google Sheet, I'm able to review, and some of their answers are in the Google Sheet as well. So now I can use the Google Sheet and go through and look at their answers and determine if they would be a good fit for the next step. And in that Google Sheet, I have a little column that says, yes, move them on to the next step. So I just put a Y in that column. And then again, Zapier is looking at that. And once that Y is applied to that cell or that column, then an email is sent to that prospective employee and they're invited to book an appointment. So an automated email goes out. It has the link to the Calendly where they can book an interview. And then once they book the interview, it updates the spreadsheet and saying, hey, this person booked the interview. This is when they booked. And there's, again, a couple other questions on the interview form for the Calendly that gets filled out into the spreadsheet as well. And then after the interview, then I go back into the spreadsheet and say, yes, I want to go forward with the second interview, or no, I don't want to. And all this stuff I can literally do on my phone. In fact, I was just on a 5-day cruise around Taiwan, and Wi-Fi was there, but it wasn't like perfect. And I was able to do a lot of the things that I was able to do while on vacation, basically. And then just because I had all the processes set up, I was able to relax. And I knew my staff would take care of everything. And it happened. And that's the beauty of having process and automation in your business, is that you can then relax and know that the automation is going to happen. I hope you enjoyed this little tutorial on automating a lot in your business, especially the sales process in your business. That's what I love to do. If you're interested in learning more about what we do, just click the link down below and schedule a time that we can chat, or just visit our website as well. Love to chat with you about what we do and how we can help you out. I've also put a couple other videos together that I think would help you out with the whole sales process, creating great presentations, and basically building your business so you get more profits. Check those out right here. And until next time, you have a great day.